"We didn't order anything for your son," my sister said, sliding him a basket of bread, while her kids enjoyed expensive steaks and dessert. My dad added, "You should have packed him food." I smiled, said noted, and stayed quiet. Then the waiter returned, and I finally stood up to speak. Hello everyone. We've officially reached our first 100 subscribers, and we couldn't have done it without your amazing support. Thank you so much for being part of our journey. Our next goal is to reach 200 subscribers by the end of this month. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and help us achieve this milestone. Every subscription means the world to us. My name is Rebecca Lawson. I'm 35 years old, and the moment I stopped begging my family to treat my son like everyone else's child happened over a basket of bread. My sister smiled at the waiter and said, "We didn't order anything for your son." Then she slid the bread basket toward my 8-year-old. Meanwhile, her 2 children happily ate $120 steaks, lobster tails, mashed potatoes, and chocolate lava cake. My son looked at me, not angry, not crying, just confused. He quietly whispered, "Mom, did I do something wrong?" That question broke something inside me. Before I could answer, my father casually took another bite of his steak and said, "You should have packed him something to eat." I simply smiled, nodded once, and quietly replied, "Noted." 10 minutes later, the waiter came back, asked me one question. I slowly stood up, turned toward my entire family, and every conversation in the restaurant stopped. But before I tell you what I said, you need to understand why I never raised my voice that night. My husband, Michael, passed away when our son, Ethan, was only 3. A distracted driver ran a red light. One ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my entire future changed. The first year afterward felt like surviving underwater. Everything hurt. Everything reminded me of him. But every morning, one little boy climbed into my bed, wrapped his tiny arms around my neck, and whispered, "We're okay, Mommy." So, I decided we would be. I worked harder than I ever imagined possible. I accepted promotions, finished my master's degree at night, eventually became director of operations for a growing healthcare company. The hours were long, the responsibility enormous, but every achievement had one purpose: giving Ethan the life his father would have wanted for him. He grew into the kindest little boy I'd ever met. Polite, curious, the child who always thanked restaurant servers, who shared his birthday presents with children who had none, who never complained, even when adults disappointed him, especially my family. Growing up, my parents adored my older sister Laura. When Laura married and had twins, the favoritism became impossible to ignore. Every Christmas, the twins received bicycles, game consoles, vacation trips. Ethan usually received socks or bookstore gift cards. He never complained. He always smiled and thanked everyone. After one Christmas, he quietly asked me in the car, "Mom, did Grandma forget what I like?" I nearly cried. "No, sweetheart. Grandma loves you." He smiled. "I know. I just think she knows them better." Children notice everything, even when adults pretend they don't. Over the years, I stopped expecting fairness. I simply focused on protecting Ethan from feeling unwanted. Then Dad announced his 70th birthday. Laura insisted on organizing everything. "I've booked the nicest steakhouse in town. It'll be wonderful." I happily agreed. Dad deserved a celebration. The restaurant was beautiful. Soft piano, crystal glasses, white tablecloths, a private dining room. About 20 family members attended. Everyone hugged Ethan, asked about school, told him how tall he'd become. For a moment, I thought maybe things had finally changed. Then the waiter arrived. He smiled politely, ready to order. Laura immediately began ordering. 2 filet mignons, 1 ribeye, lobster tail, kids' steaks for the twins, extra desserts, premium appetizers. The list continued. Eventually, the waiter looked toward Ethan, and for the young man, Laura smiled before I could speak. "Oh, we didn't order anything for him." She casually pushed the bread basket toward Ethan. "He can have bread." The waiter looked confused. "I'm sorry." Laura laughed. "Rebecca understands." I slowly looked at her. "No, I don't." She shrugged. "We only budgeted for our household." Dad immediately interrupted. "Rebecca earns plenty. If Ethan wants steak, order one yourself." Mom nodded. "Exactly. It's not a big deal." I quietly looked at Ethan. He was staring at the bread basket, trying very hard not to look disappointed. Then, he looked at me. "Mom, I'm not really hungry." I knew he was lying. He loved steak. He'd been talking about this dinner all week. Before I could respond, Dad cut into his steak and casually said, "You should have packed him something." The table laughed awkwardly. I didn't. I simply smiled. "Noted." Then I reached into my purse, pulled out a small granola bar, I always carried for emergencies. I quietly handed it to Ethan. He whispered, "Thank you," then smiled, as though I'd just given him the greatest meal in the world. The waiter looked uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. He leaned slightly toward me, speaking quietly enough that only I could hear. "Ma'am, may I ask you something?" I nodded. He whispered a single sentence. I smiled. "Yes, please." He nodded respectfully, then walked toward the kitchen. About 10 minutes later, he returned, walked directly to my chair, and quietly said, "Everything is ready." I slowly stood, smoothed my dress, turned toward my family, then looked around the silent restaurant. Every table nearby had stopped talking. Even the musicians paused. I took one slow breath, opened my mouth to speak. Sometimes, the people who humiliate you in public assume you'll quietly accept it because you always have before. But they never expect the moment you stop protecting their reputation and start protecting your child's dignity instead. The restaurant fell silent. I slowly stood. The waiter gave me a small nod, then stepped back. I looked at my father, then at my mother, then at my sister. Finally, I looked down at Ethan. He was quietly eating his granola bar, trying to pretend everything was okay. That was the moment I stopped pretending too. I smiled politely, then addressed the room. I'd like everyone's attention for just a minute. Nearby conversations stopped. Several guests looked over. The musicians lowered their instruments. I continued, "Tonight is my father's 70th birthday. I came here to celebrate him." I also believed every grandchild had been invited to dinner. No one spoke. I looked toward Laura. Apparently, only some of the grandchildren were. My sister folded her arms. "Oh, don't make a scene." I calmly replied, "I'm not. I'm simply explaining why my son is eating a granola bar while everyone else is eating steak." A ripple of uncomfortable whispers spread across the restaurant. Dad frowned. "Rebecca, sit down." I gently shook my head. "No, I've spent years sitting down. Tonight, I'm standing up for my son." The room became completely silent. Then, the waiter returned. Behind him came the restaurant manager. The manager smiled kindly. He looked directly at Ethan. "Young man, we made something special for you." A server placed a beautifully prepared steak dinner in front of Ethan. Mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, warm rolls, even a slice of chocolate cake waiting on a separate tray. Ethan looked at me. His eyes were wide. "Mom, I didn't order this." I smiled. "I know." The manager spoke gently. "Our staff noticed what happened. We'd like tonight's meal to be our gift." Tears filled my eyes. "No, I can't let you do that." He smiled. "I insist. Every child who comes through our doors deserves to feel welcome." The restaurant applauded, not loudly, warmly, kindly. My son whispered, "Thank you." The manager knelt beside him. "You don't ever have to thank someone for treating you with kindness." Then he stood and walked away. Dad stared at his untouched steak. Mom looked down at her plate. Laura looked furious. "This is ridiculous." I looked at her calmly. "No, what's ridiculous is that complete strangers noticed my son's pain before his own family did. No one defended her, not even her husband. Instead, he quietly pushed his own dessert toward Ethan. "I think this belongs with your dinner." Laura looked shocked. "David," he calmly answered. "He's 8. I'm not punishing a child." She fell silent. Dad finally cleared his throat. "You embarrassed us." I looked directly at him. "No, you embarrassed yourselves. If the staff hadn't stepped in, your grandson would have gone home believing he wasn't worth dinner." Those words landed heavily. Mom quietly began crying. "I didn't think." I answered softly. "That's exactly the problem." "You didn't." Ethan gently touched my hand. "Mom, it's okay." I smiled at him. "No, sweetheart, it's not. And none of this was your fault." He nodded quietly. Then, to everyone's surprise, Grandma slowly stood. She looked around the table. I've watched this happen for years. Every eye turned toward her. I kept telling myself I shouldn't interfere. She looked directly at my parents. I was wrong. She turned toward Ethan. "Come here, sweetheart." He walked over. She hugged him tightly. Then she looked at everyone else. "From today forward, if Rebecca and Ethan aren't treated exactly like every other member of this family, oh, don't expect me at another family gathering." Silence. Absolute silence. No one challenged Grandma, because everyone knew she meant every word. Laura quietly muttered, "You're all overreacting." Grandma looked at her. "No, we're finally reacting." Epilogue. That dinner changed everything. Not overnight, but permanently. For several months, I stopped attending family gatherings, not to punish anyone, to give Ethan peace. Instead, we started our own traditions. Christmas movie nights, Saturday breakfasts, small adventures. One evening, Ethan looked at me and smiled. "I like our family. I laughed. We're a pretty small family. He shrugged. It feels big. Because we laugh more. That sentence alone told me I'd made the right decision. Almost a year later, Dad called, not to defend himself, not to make excuses, to apologize. I failed my grandson. Yes, I'd like the chance to do better. I didn't answer immediately. Trust takes time. Eventually, we met at a small diner, just the three of us. Dad, Ethan, me. Before ordering, Dad looked at Ethan and smiled. What would you like? Ethan quietly answered, the steak. Dad laughed. So will I. When the food arrived, Dad waited until Ethan took the very first bite. Only then did he begin eating. It was a tiny moment, but sometimes, tiny moments repair the biggest wounds. My thoughts. Looking back, the most memorable person at that restaurant wasn't the family who excluded a child. It was the waiter who quietly chose kindness. Children rarely remember how expensive a meal was, but they'll always remember how adults made them feel. No child should ever wonder whether they're worth a place at the table. And no parent should stay silent when someone tries to convince their child otherwise. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give your son isn't the perfect meal. It's showing him that his dignity is never something you will allow anyone to take away.